the lack of regulation is what opens up Bali to become essentially a boom town for this type of industry. Hi, welcome to another episode of Market Insights. My name is Jing, and I'm the CEO of Bukit Vista, but I'll be providing some, I would call it unbiased market information about what's going on right now in Bali. And this week, my team has actually created a really interesting long list of questions to ask me. So here I am, pitted against an AI to answer some of the most difficult questions across on all of Bali for property investment. The latest question that is fairly challenging is this. I'll bring it up and we'll take a look at it together. And the question is, how does the lack of clear government regulations make Bali's real estate market risky for investors? Now, the insight I can offer in this particular question is as such. So what I see is actually the opposite situation. And I'll go into detail about how that happened. But first, let me tell you what I know based on my experience. So you can find me on LinkedIn, and I've been essentially working in Bali now for quite some time, almost 15 plus years. I arrived in 2005, and the first 5 years I was working in real estate, but then afterwards I got myself into two really plum positions. One was a senior project manager for Aman Resorts, and the other one was a market manager of Airbnb. Now, what exactly does that mean? So back in 2013, Airbnb was growing all over the world at every particular destination you could imagine. They were growing in Europe, North America, South America, Asia, all over the world. And so basically one of the particular things that we noticed, phenomenons that we noticed at Airbnb level, and this is a billion-dollar company with access to millions of homes at this point, was the aspect of regulation and its effect on essentially investment potential for any particular marketplace. So I'll go into detail what I mean. So certain marketplaces are fairly protected. These would be highly regulated marketplaces such as Los Angeles, Paris, London, New York, Rome. You know the names of the major urban centers. These particular marketplaces are what we call primary residential areas. These are places where cities, in fact, where people go to essentially work. And as people are looking for jobs, they become voters, they become citizens, so they essentially start voting for policies that protect the, of course, the rent and the ability for people who are working to actually find affordable rent. Now, in any democracy, as you can imagine, the number of people who rent far outweigh the number of people who actually own property. So therefore, the politics in major residential cities are in favor of more regulation to stop things like Airbnb, to stop things like home sharing from proliferating. Now, that being said, you'll see that essentially there's a second type of market that functioned quite differently while I was working at Airbnb in Bali. Bali, Tulum, Mexico, these are actually secondary cities where there's not so much a actual draw for industrial work. These are places where people go to relax, to travel. You can think of national parks. Lyon, probably in France, is experiencing a little bit of this. Secondary cities like maybe New Orleans or Austin, Texas, which is migrating into a primary city these days. But traditionally, these particular secondary locations that have been focusing on holiday rentals, these are very differently regulated than primary destinations. Why? Well, because in vacation rental markets, the whole aspect is how can you get more people to come to your city? The economy of, let's say, a particular city that is hoping to get vacation rentals, such as Lake Tahoe, such as Bali, such as Phuket, such as Koh Samui, such as Penang, such as Siem Reap in Cambodia. All these destinations primarily rely on the influx of tourism in order to actually make the most of their economy. Tourism provides jobs. Jobs then provide votership, and those policies then, of course, protect the people who have jobs. Now, looking at it through this lens and structure of what's happening in Bali, I would say you can be actually thankful that Bali has actually limited and different regulations than what you would expect in, once again, primary residential cities. Bali is primarily a tourism marketplace. Nobody who lives in Bali could legitimately complain about the arrival of tourists that help create jobs, create money, create an economy for their neighbors. So the actual, I would say, preference and the actual footing for real estate investment in Bali is always favorable towards tourism and guests, no matter what their behavior, no matter what they're doing all night, no matter how many times that they misbehave, the politics will tolerate it because it is so fundamental to the benefit of that particular economy and that particular votership and that particular constituents that you're not going to get like a regulation that say forces a situation as you would get in a New York, Los Angeles, Tokyo, LA, or any other primary residential city. All right, so hopefully that actually gives a counterintuitive but also a very fulfilling idea around how actually the lack of regulation is not actually risky for investors. It's actually quite the opposite. The lack of regulation is what opens up Bali to become essentially a boom town for this type of industry. This is exactly what Bali is looking forward to have. The fewer regulations that impede upon, let's say, the growth of tourism, then the better. And all tourism is anchored on the place that you're going to stay. So accommodations is pretty fundamental in terms of its ability to essentially center and also disperse the economy of a particular location to all the various corners of that world. Let me explain a little bit more what I mean about that. For a very long time in the history of Bali, most of the tourism was concentrated here in Nusa Dua. You'll see that traditionally, the main pathway for tourism was actually coming from, well, right here, from the airport directly to the BTDC area. This was called the Bali Tourism Development Commission. Now I think it's called the International Development Commission. It's got a different name these days. But this particular way of tourism essentially limited the progression of tourism mostly to the largest investors, who most often were not even for Bali. So the arrangement in the 1960s, when Bali's tourism industry first really had its first boom, was that international investors would partner with local Indonesian oligarchs, basically. These people had large industries. These people sold palm oil, coal, natural resource wealth. They wanted to essentially take their rupiahs and invest and trade for foreign currency. So what they did was they amended and invested in all this land and all these properties down here in Nusa Dua, and they would agree to build hotels, to hire staff, to hire senior managers, and in return, foreign brands such as Hilton, Hyatt, Marriott, all these big names would come and agree to actually manage those properties here along the Nusa Dua coastline. This might come as a surprise and an insight too to many of our viewers that the hotels actually bearing the names of those big brands that you see, whether it's a Four Seasons or Intercontinental or Marriott or any of those international brands, they actually most of the time are not actually owned by the brand. So the brand that you see on the hotel is simply the management and marketing company. So we know this because at Bukit Vista, that's essentially what we do. The owners of a property are actually the owners. They bought the land, they bought the building, they pay for the staff, they pay for us, right, as managers. But the actual management company that brands the property, now that's a different entity. And so the arrangement made in the 60s was essentially that this particular segment would be dedicated for tourism. But if you think about it over the long course, through the socio-political Bali, the majority of Balinese residents were not content with this arrangement. This particular arrangement essentially made it such that they would be entrapped in a life of servitude. The only jobs that Balinese people could get in this particular area were waiters, drivers, cooks, chefs, and these fairly entry-level hospitality positions. So over time, essentially, there became a grumbling along the local politics, as there should be, for why there wasn't more fair actual distribution and equity for the tourism market pie. So in effect, what happened later was that it wasn't so much that, let's say, the people got together and protested and asked for essentially a decentralization of the tourism industry that had been slowly built up here in Nusa Dua. But when platforms like Airbnb, Booking.com, Agoda came along, they essentially democratized the process of essentially building brands. So that process was at first I guess it was essentially countered by the government because the government did want to regulate it. And back in 2019, slightly before COVID, there had been talks between the tourism minister and Airbnb about integrating essentially a way that Airbnb could directly pay taxes to the Ministry of Tourism. But somehow those talks never really materialized for some reason. And I don't know why, but there had been initial, let's say, plans to actually get that started, but they didn't actually come into fruition. Let me just double check my facts here, right? But I think I look it up on Google. You can go for Minister of Tourism, Bali, and Airbnb tax, okay? Maybe that will show it up. All right, so yeah, there was essentially oh, here it is, all right. Corrected myself, all right. So it was actually not in 2019, it was essentially 2022. So 2022, Airbnb published this press release that Airbnb and the Ministry of Tourism would be looking to essentially promote one-stop travel on remote working to try to develop Bali as a remote working hub. At that point, that was really interesting because essentially we were looking to ramp up tourism, and then like COVID and everything. So this was a good plan for how to get through the interim. And so there had already been this discussion about how to cooperatively regulate the tourism industry here in Bali. But once again, as with a lot of things in Indonesia, this was a plan. It didn't really materialize, and still hosts to this day essentially are not directly paying their fees to the Ministry of Tourism, which would have been, I think, an interesting high point in the regulation of, let's say, the industry. Now, okay, why do I talk about all this particular gobbledygook? What am I getting at? So the idea is this. If you fundamentally think about how laws are created in a democracy, laws are created through the collective votes of the populace there. And so Bali will create laws that fits Bali's purposes, unless, of course, it's like COVID, in which that case the national government took over and closed our airports for 2 years, which was really, really, really terrible for business. But for the majority part, just ask yourself a simple question. Are Balinese people likely to vote benefits that essentially extend their value of land and their economic benefits to zero? Would Balinese people actually vote against their own self-interest to gain the benefits of not being essentially servants over here in Nusa Dua or working in low-level menial daily work jobs in hospitality, but get ownership of the hospitality industry through ownership of land, through ownership of their own businesses? It's kind of hard to fight that one, isn't it, right? How could you see a regulation that could effectively put that industry into a more difficult situation? It would be almost counterintuitive to expect that. So, in the bright light of things, I would say that it's actually long-term trend-wise, it's probably the opposite fear. It's not that regulation makes it risky. It's probably that maybe not enough regulation to, let's say, slow down uncontrolled development in certain areas and having this free-for-all. That probably is the largest risk, rather than a risk of, let's say, for example, taking back your property because it's illegal or something like that. I don't think that is necessarily the primary risk that people are considering. So I would say regulation in Bali is in favor of tourism, and it will likely to be always in favor of tourism until the day comes when maybe the established owners of properties don't want any more market expansion, and then there could be a limitation. There could be a more stringent licensing system set up to limit the amount of new properties being built. But at that point, we'll have to see. Because once again, the majority of Bali still is not involved in the active tourism industry. Most people, when they think of Bali, they think of this part and perhaps a slight smidgen over here in Ubud. And once again, we can show you on the 3D spatial maps here of what that picture looks like in a second, right? So you have to remember that the overall prosperity within Bali is not exactly uniformly spread out everywhere. And I'll show you what I mean here. So the overall prosperity in Bali, okay, where am I? All right, here we go. So hopefully you can see this particular 3D spatial map. And this map shows essentially the areas of highest heat, review density, which by our standards is where we understand that there's tourism activity happening here. You can see that there's a plenitude of activity along the coastline here on the west coast. And of course, on the Bukit area, there's a lot of activity. And over here in the core center of Ubud, there's quite a lot of activity happening. But there's a lot of Balinese people, including my family that lives over here in East Bali from Karangasem. You can see the actual tourism activity is pretty sparse. So you have to remember the majority of people voting are not all living in this particular area. And also there's a huge number of people who have middle to low income jobs living in Denpasar in the center. That's why you don't see any tourism activity, because this is actually a residential area. That then lends to the picture of, okay, who's going to be in control of the votes? Is it going to be the people who are not yet benefiting from the tourism industry, or the people who have already been established? So Bali has, close to 3 to 4 million people? Let's check. So population of Bali. Okay, wow. Okay, it's gone up. It's 4.4 million people. And I'm pretty sure that less than 10% of them actually are actively involved as landlords, as active participants in the hospitality industry. So there's plenty more votes that will most likely go towards greater and greater development, which could be good or bad depending upon how you see things. All right, so hopefully this market insight offers a fresh perspective and offers a new particular way at looking at how regulation affects the risk profile for an investment in Bali, and how maybe a new consideration of how regulation should be taken into account. Once again, I'm Jing, and please feel welcome to comment, contest me, challenge me, offer your feedback on the comments below, engage. I want this to be an open discussion with our viewership. And if you made it so far, like, subscribe, comment, do the whole thing that normally you do on YouTube. It will help us reach more people, and hopefully we can aim for a mission of better educating investors to make a smart Bali investment decision. Okay, all right, signing off today from here in California, Jing with Market Insights.